This week, we're talking about environmental damage. As we start this next portion of the class, we're going to start focusing on the impacts and environmental stressors and things like that. So the first thing we're going to look at is the impacts of air pollution. So I thought we'd start by talking about some of the key terms. So environmental stressors, or just stressors in general, are factors whose influence is to constrain productivity or like reproductive success and ecosystem development. And there are four basic types of environmental stressors out there. There are cataclysmic, stressful life events, daily hassles, and ambient stressors. Cataclysmic events comprise sudden catastrophes that affect many individuals all at the same time, like a flood or a landslide or an avalanche or an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, things like that. It could also be like a nuclear power plant if we're talking like environmental disasters, or a chemical plant accident, or toxic waste dumps, things like that. So cataclysmic events are seldom predictable, neither with their respect to existing or with their respect to what's going to happen after, but they are usually expected to be rather short. Stressful life events are major incidents in the course of life that require major individual adaptive responses, such as a change in work or your residential environment, like you get a new job, or you move to a new residential area, or you do major construction. These events are actually also short, but the consequences may be long or permanent. Daily hassles are repeatedly occurring events of ordinary life, like arguments with your colleagues or traffic congestion. And although they typically are more or less predictable, the individual has little means to avoid such a hassle, and the duration, again, is very short. Ambient stressors is a term proposed by Campbell in the, 82, 83-ish, which denoted more continuous and intractable background characteristics of a physical environment. They often go unnoticed, like the continuous hum of an air conditioner, the permanent dust of an industrial area, the hiss of a central heating system. Most people believe that they can adapt to these stressors, and they consider the cost of coping with them to be higher than simply enduring them. All right. So I thought we'd do some review, just in case we haven't talked about it, just to hit upon it again. And that is 99% of the atmosphere is made up of two gases. 78% is nitrogen, 21% is oxygen, which the label didn't come out, I apologize. And the rest is carbon dioxide, ozone, as well as water vapor and other salts and dusts and things like that. There are two types of pollutants, primary and secondary. Primary pollutants are emitted directly from a source, whereas a secondary pollutant is not directly emitted, but forms when other pollutants, such as primary pollutants, react in the atmosphere. Secondary pollutants are harder to control because they have different ways of synthesizing, and the formation are not well understood. They form naturally in the environment and cause problems like photochemical smog. Now let's talk about types of air. So we already talked about what the atmosphere is made of, and so into this great mixture of gases and pollutants, thousands of things are discharged continuously from human activities and certain natural processes around the world. These are the major pollutants. Of the great mass pollutants discharged into the atmosphere, we designate only a handful as major pollutants. They are singled out for two reasons. One, they are known to have a significant impact on the environment and or human health. And two, they are produced in relatively large quantities by human activity over much of the earth. There's a great article from the CDC that really goes into each of these, and the EPA, again, has identified criteria because it regulates them by developing human health-based and or environmentally based criteria and setting like what they call permissible levels. So a level at which it's okay to have, which is really ironic when you think about it. I mean, So there's like a level of lead that can be in your air and it's not considered toxic to your health. And there's numerous movies I've seen recently about that. The one that comes to mind is Black Water. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I'll probably mention it again when we talk about water pollution. But Black Water is about the Teflon company, so DuPont Chemical. I think it's DuPont makes Teflon. Anyways, I digress. Let me get back to it. So the 6 pollutants, again, are carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, ground level ozone, particle pollution, usually what we call particulates or particulate matter, and sulfur oxides. The relative balance between natural and human contributions of pollution is sometimes not so easy to really sort out. For instance, pollutants such as heat and harmful radiation are very difficult to separate into human and natural classes because the sources are mixed, extensive, they are geographically complex in their distribution. On the other hand, synthetic organic compounds and nitrogen dioxide are produced solely by human activities. And when they are found in air samples, there is no doubt about their source. I'd like to share this short video with you put together by National Geographic. So this is a great article, by the way, but in here is a video. You scroll down to it. Hopefully it doesn't.
Air pollution consists of chemicals or particles in the atmosphere that pose serious health and environmental threats. But what causes air pollution, and what does it mean for our planet? Some air pollution comes from natural sources like volcanic eruptions, wildfires, or allergens. But most air pollution results from human activities, such as energy use and agriculture. There are different types of human-made air pollution. When we burn fossil fuels to produce energy, they release greenhouse gases into the air. These emissions, such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, trap heat from the sun in Earth's atmosphere, leading to a rise in global temperatures. This creates a cycle where air pollution contributes to climate change, and climate change creates higher temperatures. In turn, higher temperatures intensify some types of air pollution. For example, climate change increases smog because it forms in the presence of high heat and increased levels of ultraviolet radiation. More frequent extreme weather, such as flooding, contributes to damp conditions and therefore to a rise in mold. Warmer weather also leads to longer pollen seasons and therefore more pollen production. Smog is a type of air pollution that reduces visibility and has serious health effects. Smog can be divided into 2 categories: sulfurous and photochemical. Sulfurous smog is made up of chemical compounds called sulfur oxides. It occurs when burning sulfur-bearing fossil fuels such as coal. Photochemical smog, also called ground-level ozone, is a result of the reaction between sunlight, nitrogen oxides, and volatile organic compounds. Nitrogen oxides come from car exhaust, coal power plants, and factory emissions. Volatile organic compounds are released from gasoline, paints, and many cleaning solvents. Smog not only creates a brown haze that reduces visibility, but also harms plants, irritates the eyes, and causes respiratory distress. Another category of air pollution is toxic pollutants. These are chemicals such as mercury, lead, dioxins, and benzene that are released during gas or coal combustion, waste incineration, or burning of gasoline. In addition to adverse environmental effects, toxic air pollution can cause serious health problems such as cancer, reproductive complications, and birth defects. While air pollution has many consequences for our planet, there are solutions. we can limit toxic pollutants, smog, and greenhouse gases by decreasing the use of fossil fuels, such as in transportation, manufacturing, and electricity generation. Reducing air pollution not only contributes to a cleaner environment and better human health, but can also slow the rate of global warming.
All right. So now that we've gotten through that, let's talk about sources of air pollution. So there are four main pollution air sources. Mobile sources like cars, buses, planes. They account for about half, or actually more than half, of all the air pollution in the United States. And the primary mobile source of air pollution is, of course, the automobile, according to the EPA. Next are stationary sources such as power plants, oil refineries, industrial facilities, factories. They emit large amounts of pollution from a single location. They're also known as point source pollution. The next one is natural sources such as windblown dust, burning your fireplace, agricultural areas, things like that. They are made up of smaller pollution sources that aren't a big deal by themselves, but when considered as a group, they can get to be a little overwhelming. The next one is pollution from human-generated and natural sources, which are often created in place and transported through the air. Sometimes chemical reactions in the atmosphere change pollutants before they're deposited, and pollutants in the air can create haze, making it harder to see, and pollution deposit can have biological effects. Location and even the time of year can determine which pollution sources are most important in each place. For example, in Joshua Tree National Park, they're starting to look at, or starting to notice, I shouldn't say look at, they've been looking at it for decades, but starting to notice the increase in grass. Grass is growing because of the amount of nitrogen that is being stored in the soil by this, deposition from smog and other things from down in the Coachella and other regions. So the behavior of pollutants and the resultant pattern of their distribution in the atmosphere depends on many factors. Among these is the structure and motion of the air and the densities of the pollutants themselves. In still air, airborne particles such as sooty debris from exhaust stacks tend to settle rapidly. The largest and heaviest particles fall out immediately around their discharge point near factories and power plants' exhaust stacks. The fallout pattern can be traced by looking at the distribution of dirt blanketing and neighboring the landscape. Intermediate sized particles usually remain suspended for several days and can spread over a much larger volume of air than the larger particles. In urban areas, they contribute to the formation of dust domes, which are large envelopes of dirt, the air, over air and cities. When the atmosphere is set in motion, the density of pollutants is less important because the force of the wind's turbulent motion tends to keep pollutants aloft. One critical question in this regard is the behavior of the downward train or plume of pollution emanating from a factory, power plant, forest fire, or city. The behavior of pollution plumes depends not only on wind turbulence and direction, but on the thermal structure of the atmosphere. The thermal structure of the lower atmosphere controls the elevation and the general pattern of plume behavior. So let's look at three of them. As you can see in the diagram, there's actually more of them, but the three main ones are looping, fumigation, and fanning. But before we do that, it's important to remember what inversion is. So normally in the atmosphere during the day, the warm air is at the bottom and the cool air is up above. Now, the benefit of that is that warm air rises and cool air sinks. Cool air is heavier, warm air is lighter, so it's going to rise. That's what we call convection. That is what we call a type of atmosphere that is unstable, meaning it's able to move around. Okay, so that's what we want. We want that mixing to occur. There is also what we call inversion, and that is when the cool air is at the surface and the warm air is at top. Remember, warm air is cooler, cold air is warm air is cooler. Warm air is lighter and cool air is heavier, and cold air wants to sink anyway. So if the cold air is already at the bottom, then the air doesn't really have any opportunity to kind of move up and mix. So let's talk about these three that I wanted to talk about. So looping. In an unstable atmosphere, that's one with a warmer, lighter air at the surface and the cooler air above, plumes move both vertically, so up and down, and laterally, horizontally, as you can see in the first little diagram there, with natural turbulence of the air. Indeed, their behavior in a crosswind may be erratic and take on a looping plume before being dispersed in the atmosphere. By contrast, if the atmosphere is stable, that is thermally inverted with the cool air at the surface and the warm air aloft, the plume tends to be contained beneath the inversion layer. Under these conditions, which are usually associated with very light wind, the concentration of pollutants can become very great because they are boxed into this small volume of air, and diffusion upward and laterally is retarded. The most hazardous situations are caused by sinking air associated with the thermal inversion. These give rise to fumigation plumes that settle to the ground and blanket the landscape. Fanning plumes are somewhat less serious because the inversion layer is higher and the volume of air into which the pollutants are dispersed is greater. One such example of smog and one example of toxic smog occurred in 1952 in London, and I'd like for you to watch this video.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 5th of December 1952, the Great Smog of London descended on the British capital due to a combination of air pollution and weather conditions. To maximise revenues in the aftermath of the Second World War, the British government had opted to export the country's better quality hard coal and retain the more sulphurous low-grade coal for domestic consumption. Smoke from burning this coal in domestic fires to offset the particularly cold winter of 1952 combined with pollutants from Greater London's numerous power stations, factories and public transport to create a thick, noxious blanket of smog over the city. The thick, yellow-black smog was held over London for more than 4 days due to the arrival of a high-pressure weather system. This caused an anticyclone that stopped the polluted air from rising into the atmosphere. Windless conditions and London's position in a river valley also meant that the smog was unable to be blown away. Visibility in the city was reduced to just a few metres, bringing public transport to a halt and forcing schools and businesses to close. Meanwhile, people across the city breathed in the toxic air and began to succumb to respiratory infections. Cattle at the Smithfield Show at Earl's Court reportedly suffocated, and while nobody made the connection until several months after the smog had lifted, estimates state that between 4,000 and 12,000 Londoners died as a direct result of breathing the polluted air. In response, the government began to rethink its policy towards air pollution and, in 1956, introduced the Clean Air Act that established smoke control areas where only clean fuels could be burned, precipitating a shift towards the use of cleaner coals, electricity, and gas as sources of heat.
Another example is acid rain.
What is acid rain? Acid rain is any form of precipitation with high levels of nitric and sulfuric acids. It can occur in the form of snow, fog, and even dry materials that settle to Earth. Most acid rain is caused by human activities. When people burn fossil fuels, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides are released into the atmosphere. These gases react with water, oxygen, and other substances to form sulfuric and nitric acid. Winds may spread these acidic solutions over hundreds of miles. After it falls to Earth, acid rain enters water systems as runoff and sinks into the ground. This can make water toxic to crayfish, clams, fish, and other aquatic animals. The rest of the food chain, including non-aquatic species such as birds, is often affected as well. Acid rain also harms forests by damaging trees' leaves, robbing the soil of essential nutrients, and making it hard for trees to take up water. By designing cleaner power plants and using fewer fossil fuels, we can reduce the number of pollutants that create acid rain.
All right, so now that we see some of the consequences of air pollution, let's look at patterns in an urban region. Most of the patterns in an urban region are comprised of a complex system of closely packed land uses linked together by transportation systems. Pollution sources are both stationary, for example, a power plant, or mobile, like a car. And for most large cities, the emission rates vary in different parts of the city. In general, the land use density increases towards the city center, and the level of pollution generally increases with land use density. For example, particulate levels in the inner city are typically 2 to 3 times higher than in suburban areas, and 5 times higher than in rural areas. But if we look at most cities today, they're more complex in their geographic arrangement of land use, like we described above. They tend to be more what we call multi-nucleated. So before I show you the next little picture here, I wanted to point out again, what we're talking about is these are polluting power plants, for example, and you can see as you get out of the dense urban center of Los Angeles and out into the suburban and rural areas, that pollution dissipates. All right, so what we mean by multi-nucleated is there are many different centers of concentrated land use within an urban region. So rather than a single city center in the middle, each of these centers is characterized by different land use activity, for example, industrial, commercial, different levels and types of air pollution interspersed among these centers in a broad matrix of residential and institutional land use, as well as parks, cemeteries, and other open spaces. So what do we mean by that? Well, some cities are organized like this. You have the central business district in the middle, then you have, as you move further out, you get into, the commuter zone and, more rural areas. But in a multi-nucleated model, like the one in the lower right, you have a city center here, and then you have a smaller city center over here, and then you have another factory over here for industrial stuff. And so this kind of is almost like Los Angeles. So let me go back to this picture here. If you're not familiar with Los Angeles, here's the city center here, right? Here's the harbor at Long Beach, okay? Here's the 710 freeway. This is where all the trucks go to deliver goods. They come out of the port of Long Beach, they pick up all their stuff, they go to the trains at Los Angeles, they put it on trains, and the stuff is transported, or they just drive wherever the material needs to go. But a lot of stuff is still put on trains. So this corridor right here is particularly filled with a lot of industrial areas. Then you have cities like Commerce, you have cities like the City of Industry along the freeway. And so you've got, Century City out here, which is where they make movies and such, so you've got all these little multiple nucleuses of little cities that have cropped up. Now, none of them are as big as Los Angeles, but they do have a downtown region, and within that downtown there are industrial and manufacturing areas, and things like that. So all right, so let's go back. Let's go back to this. So this is an example here of a place that has that multiple nucleus model. So these are all commercial and industrial areas. All the yellow is residential. And so you can see it's kind of like spread out all over the place. You've got, you know, you've got lots of commercial, industrial, just kind of spread out among different areas. This is a map of Indianapolis, Indiana, kind of demonstrating this multiple nucleus model where you have multiple multiple industrial and commercial areas throughout an area. It's not like a circular model where you have just one city center and then you just go out and eventually it gets into, you know, suburbia. Highway corridors are notorious for several levels of air pollution, especially when traffic is backed up and the atmosphere is relatively still. This is related not only to the massive volumes of vehicles on the highway, which is about 200 to 300,000 vehicles a day, but to the fact that automobile engines are less efficient combustors at low speeds. So carbon monoxide levels in traffic jams may exceed 100 parts per million, more than 1,000 times the atmospheric background level. There's a great article here about Google Maps, and showing you, you know, different cities. They did it in Oakland. They also just recently did a study using Google cars, you know, like the Google Map cars, to look at London. Also very fascinating. So this is, you know, using Google cars to collect particulate matters as they are driving around, you know, town, which I thought, wow, that's a really cool idea. So the article is here if you want to take a look at that. It's pretty interesting. But this is Oakland, shows you, you know, smog levels and stuff like that, or pollutant levels, I should say. Generally speaking, the smallest scale for consideration in air pollution studies is the interior of a home, or even just an industrial building would also be like, so now we're talking about air pollution within rather than air pollution on the outside. We're talking about air pollution inside. So generally, air inside a building, even in the inner city or an industrial area, is cleaner than the outside air. However, many buildings have their own peculiar air quality problems. For example, over the past 2 decades, there's been an increased evidence of a phenomenon known as new building sickness. I hadn't heard of this until I was researching for this. In factories, internal air pollution has long been recognized as a serious problem. The pollutant types and levels depend on the types of industrial operations, the design and maintenance of the facilities, and precautions such as air filtering. Some of the worst indoor pollution is associated with heavy industry like foundries or steel mills or blast furnaces, things like that. Although cleaner than industrial buildings, residential buildings are not free of indoor air pollution. Synthetic compounds from solvents and sprays, and carbon monoxide and particles from fireplaces and cigarettes are common household pollutants. Another pollutant is a radioactive gas, radon, which is known as a source of lung cancer. In the mid-'80s, it came into public attention that radon, which is a natural gas released from decaying radioactive elements in the earth, they actually had found that the cracks, there are seeps in the Earth's crust, and it's like seeping 6% or it seeps into 6% of all the homes in the United States. So about 6 million homes are impacted by this radon gas, which I was like, whoa, that's crazy. So we've talked about what it is, what types there are. Let's talk about what kinds of problems are associated with it. So air pollution is a familiar environmental health hazard. We know what we're looking at when brown haze settles over a city, exhaust billows across a busy highway, a plume rises from a smokestack. But some air pollution is not seen, but its pungent smell alerts you. It's a major threat to global health and prosperity. Air pollution in all forms is responsible for more than 6.5 million deaths each year globally, a number that has increased over the past 2 decades. And as you can see in the diagram, these are some of the health issues associated with pollution in the air. Air pollution control is pursued more or less at all scales from global to local, including the home and workspace. Within the developed countries, progress has been made on certain fronts, especially with 2 major air pollution sources, cars and power plants. On the other hand, acid rain is increasing and carbon dioxide and ozone depletion continue to worsen over much of the industrial world. I recently was painting my house, and it's amazing how many of the paint products are now labeled low VOCs, which are volatile organic chemicals, which are considered air pollutants. I was like, wow, that's like crazy. I mean, they used to put lead in paint, so you know that went away. But you know, hey, it's still out there, right? But there are signs of hope. As you can see here, pollution emissions in the United States shows a decrease in silicon dioxides and nitrous oxides and volatile organic chemicals. And this is mostly seen in developed countries. A short history of clean air, at least in the US. The Clean Air Act wasn't the first major change in the regulatory environment. The National Ambient Air Quality Standard, what is called NAAQs, define two levels of air quality standards: primary standards designed to protect the health of people, and two secondary standards designed to protect against environmental degradation. In the 1970s and 80s, we saw changes to the motor vehicles with the addition of catalytic converters and CAFE, which is corporate average fuel economy standards, which were mandated. And as a result of these actions, pollution rates per automobile have dropped significantly, and lead levels in air and water declined over most of the United States. I know that when I was growing up as a kid, there were smog days. There were days where they would tell us we couldn't go out and play because it was too smoggy. And now I don't think there's been a smog alert. Of course, there's tons of kids with asthma now and other things, you know, that show signs that our air is not as clean as it could be. But that's one thing. And, you know, that's mostly because of the, you know, catalytic converters, which have been the new hotbed thing to steal, apparently. And also the fact that we have smog regulations. They took the lead out of gas. So the whole time I was growing up, we had regular gas. And then like in the 80s, they started making unleaded gas, which is, you know, pretty much all you see is unleaded and diesel. There's no more leaded gas, which really made, you know, mowing the lawn a little tricky because you used leaded gas. But they've figured out a way, I guess, to make that work. I wish they'd use an electric mower. That would be kind of cool. Anyways, again, digressing. All right, so before I go, so that was the last thing I want to talk about. Oh, let me talk about, so these again are some of the like things. So the Air Pollution Control Act in 1955 was the first federal legislation involving air pollution. It approved spending to do some research to A, figure out if it's a big deal that we're polluting our air, and B, you know, what can we do about it? And then in 63 came the Clean Air Act 1.0, is as I affectionately like to call it, which again did funding again for research and creating standards. And then the real Clean Air Act, which is also when the EPA came into being, set those quality standards to protect health. And then there's been a couple more, and the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was a big kerfluffle thing. Politics, you know, should we sign it? Should we not sign it? And then one president signed it, another president undid the signing of it. And so it's just been, you know, crazy thing. Here in the state of California, we have some great goals for cutting our, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. Like all cars have to be like hybrid, I think, or, you know, electric completely by 2030 or something like that. I don't know. So I don't think you can sell gas powered vehicles after 2025 or 2030 or something like that. I should have looked it up before I gave this lesson, but oh well, you can look it up if you're curious. But it's true, we are phasing out gas powered vehicles in the state of California to cut down on our emissions, and we have some of the cleanest air. Part of that is, you know, the emission standards that we have, the smog certification you have to get on your cars and stuff like that, taking smog polluting vehicles off the road, you know, things like that. So, all right, sorry. So before I go, I found this great graphic, and I really wanted to use it, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. So here it is. I don't know, I just thought it was really cool. It kind of talks about particulate matter, and it talks about, you know, ppm 2.5. That's the size of the particle. So there's like ppm 2.5, ppm 5, ppm 10. So 2.5 is the smallest one. So we want to make sure that we pay attention to that. And then talking about the effects of particulate matter and air pollution and pollen and all that stuff. And then some of the impacts on our overall health, which I thought was kind of cool. This website is really freaking cool. I want to take you to it. Hopefully this works. So this shows you air quality in the world by the moment. So if I zoom out, control, oh, if I click on it, does it get bigger? Oh, here it is. If I click on that, sorry. So these are how much pollution is going on in each of these places. So these are the top, 10 worst places to be right now. Green means good. So we have really good air right now in California. That's because it's really been cloudy and stuff. You can see throughout the Sahara, you can see the wind pattern, like how winds are moving and things like that, which is also kind of cool. We don't really have a lot of data in Russia. That's why it's all blank like that. But I don't know. I just thought it was really cool. You can zoom in to different places, and so let's look at what's going on over here in New Delhi. New Delhi is renowned for having poor air quality. Hey, looks like there's a fire. Hey, look at that. So looks like there's a fire and there's some wind. I don't know. I just thought this was a really cool little website. So if you have a chance, take a look at that. So this is the 3D one. This one's also very cool. It renders it on a globe, so you don't get any of that distortion. So things look as big as they're supposed to be. So let's go over here to Thailand. What's going on in Thailand? Should be. Hey, Alexa, what time is it in Thailand? It's 3:54 in the morning. So that's weird. You'd think it would be dark, and so there wouldn't be a lot of pollution going on there. Anyways, so check out that website if you get a chance, if you're, kind of curious. I don't know, I like playing with it. And some important terms that I think are important that I didn't really talk about. Urban sprawl, also called suburban sprawl or just sprawl, is the rapid expansion of cities and towns, usually characterized by low density residential housing, single use zones, and an increased reliance on private automobiles for transportation. Cluster development, or more efficiently or more accurately termed residential cluster development, is a form of land development in which buildings and structures are grouped together on a site, thus saving the remaining land for common open space or conservation or recreation. And so sometimes we see a number of these developments. So they'll create like a development, and there'll be like a park within the development. Or I know they do a lot of these in California as like a what do you call it? Like a walled in or gated. They call them gated communities, and within the community you have everything you pretty much need for open space and stuff like that. Inversion, I talked about this before, but I wanted to highlight it again. Inversion in the atmosphere is when air temperature increases with height. The way it should be is it should decrease with height. So an inversion is present in the lower part of a cap. The cap is a layer of relatively warm air aloft above the inversion. And then the last one is an urban heat island. which occur when cities replace natural land cover with dense concentration of pavements and buildings and other substances that absorb and retain heat, thereby effectively increasing the heat in that area. We see a lot of this in, like New York and Los Angeles and places like that, where we've paved over, even in the suburbs sometimes, in areas that are highly paved rather than have a lot of natural green open space, which increases costs for air conditioning. It increases air pollution levels and other heat related illness and mortality things. So those are the 4 bonus terms for this week. Again, if you have any questions, you know where to find me. And thank you and have a great week.